Book of Beginnings, lesson 15, I guess, titled Only Son, and we're going to start with the 22nd chapter. I guess I will, if this, let's see. I said there wasn't a charging this thing and didn't, there we go. Genesis 22:1. To me, this is probably the most important chapter in the book of Genesis because of the subject matter and what it's going to be talking about here, and with us how that relates to who Jesus is and how that goes together, which I won't get real deep into that, which is because we're going through a study of the book of Genesis, the book of beginnings. So Genesis 22:1 says, "After these things God tested Abraham and said to him, 'Abraham.' 'Here I am,' he answered. 'Take your son,' he said, 'your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about.'" So we have here a situation where, if you can put yourself in Abraham's position, where he's asked to carry his son to sacrifice his only son. He's talking about his only son. So we refer to this, because I'm using a Jewish concordance with this, we refer to this as the sacrifice of Isaac. They refer to this as the binding of Isaac, because they don't like to use. There's a lot of the rabbis do this, not all of them, but there's many of them that do, because they prefer to refer to it as the binding of Isaac, because Isaac was not killed and Isaac was not sacrificed, and they look at it differently than what we do. So it says, only son. Was this his only son? Was this Abraham's only son? How many sons did he have? He had two, and the other one was Ishmael. When it says only son, if you look in some translations, in some of the English translations, it says favorite son or special son or something like that, rather than only son. So I looked up the Hebrew word for only son, and it means this: properly united, for instance, soul, by implication, beloved, also lonely, the life, as not to be replaced, darling, desolate, only, child, son, solitary. So if you look at the overall meaning of what they're talking about there, it's easy to see why the translators, most all the translations, put that as only son. And I think that's really what it means, because of the spiritual significance of who he was in relation to who Ishmael was, his older brother. And what had God told Abraham about Isaac? So I go back to the 17th chapter of Genesis, verse 19. It said, "But God said, 'No, your wife Sarah will bear a son.'" Let me tell you what came up before this. What came up before this is God came to Abraham and said that Sarah's going to have a son, you and Sarah are going to have a son. And he said, "Wouldn't Ishmael do? Isn't he all right? I mean, I'm an old man. It's not a good time to be having a bunch of kids around." He said, "Wouldn't Ishmael do?" And God said, "No. Your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will name him Isaac. I will confirm my covenant with him." It says, "I will confirm my covenant with him," not Ishmael, with him, "as an everlasting covenant for his future offspring." So when it came to the covenant, Abraham did only have one son, because this was the son of the covenant. This was the son of the promise, where Ishmael was the son of the flesh, was the son of their work. They decided to make that work. That's not what God told them to do. But and when we talked about this, and anytime I get to this particular part back in the 16th chapter, when we have what happened with Hagar and Isaac and with Sarah, and then they put together a scheme so that they could have a son, and it didn't work out well. Usually our schemes don't work out quite as good as God's does. What would be your response to God if He told you to sacrifice, to slaughter your son? If God appeared to you, you knew it was God, and He told you to kill your only son. So the reason I say that is because that puts us in a position of thinking how Abraham would have acted, how you would have acted, how I would have responded to this. And the question is, would God ask that of anyone today? And the answer is no. And so I said, what's occurred since then? Abraham's seed has grown into a nation and has become a blessing to the whole world. That was the point of the whole thing with Isaac. The law was given to Moses, and in the law to Moses was given a commandment that you do not do murder, period. You don't kill people, you don't kill innocent people. And so it's written in the law. Also, Jesus came and fulfilled the law. So we know that even with the law, He was the fulfillment of the law. So what that was leading up to with Isaac and sacrificing Isaac is what led us to Jesus. And now there's no need for a physical sacrifice. I'm glad we don't have to come to church and bring us some sheep and start cutting them up and throwing them on the fire out front and burning them up. That would be a fun service, wouldn't it? But that's the way they did. So. As we go through this chapter, this 22nd chapter, think about how Abraham responded and how he acted before this time and how he responds this time, and how much Abraham has changed since he was Abram until he became Abraham and he was to carry his son. If God had came to him and said, when Ishmael was his only son, and said, I want you to take Ishmael up there and kill him, I think he would have acted much, much differently at that time than he would at this. We all hope that we have matured spiritually, and we should be growing spiritually. Well, Abraham was. I just wanted to. Some of the rabbis say the reason that Abraham did not reason with God about this and try to talk him out of it is because of the discussion he had with God about Sodom and Gomorrah, and it didn't work out so well with Sodom and Gomorrah. I don't think that's necessarily the truth, but I would not be given a full account of what I've seen, what the different rabbis say if I did not say that. 22:1. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. Could God trust Abraham to be the one that carried out the covenant? And did Abraham know that he could trust himself? And so he's being tested here. And it's because it says so. After these things, God tested Abraham. He was checking him out to see if this could be the one. But do you think God knew already whether Abraham was going to listen to him or not? In my thinking, he already knew. So who was he proving it to? He's proving it to Abraham. See who you are and how far you'll go with this. 22 verse 3. So Abraham got up early in the morning. I always like that scripture. He's told to go the next day and sacrifice his son. Only son, favorite son, everyhow you want to look at it. To sacrifice him, to kill him, to burn him on an altar. And he gets up early in the morning. I might have slept late that day. I'd have stalled as much as I could. But Abraham got up early, saddled his donkey, took with him 2 of his young men and his son Isaac. He split wood for a burnt offering and set out to go to the place God had told him about. Now, when we picture the sacrifice we see the paintings they've done and the pictures and things that different people have done. You see Abraham standing there and Isaac tied up on the altar, and you see this ram with his horns caught there and an angel standing over there, and we see this picture. You think about it. He had to do all this preparation. What if you had to go out and you had to split wood, you had to get everything together, so he had plenty of time to think about this. He had plenty of time to contemplate what was going on. He couldn't just go do it, get it over with, and be done with it like we see it in the pictures. This took a while. And it's I've heard different people guess different ages. My thinking from what I see, he was probably around 20. So he was old enough if he was old enough that if he didn't want to get tied up by a 100-year-old man, he wouldn't have been, as far as I'm concerned. 100-plus-year-old man. He split wood for a burnt offering and set out to go to the place God had told him about. So God told him a place to go. Now, it doesn't tell us in the scripture that God had told him where God told him to go, but we know where, according to custom, where he wound up, and we'll talk about that in a minute. It says, on the third day, the third day. Some people, some rabbis again, say the third day is figurative. It just means an important mission, but I think it means the third day. That's what it says. It took him 3 days. He had to split the wood. He had to get the donkey. He had to get his servants. He had to get Isaac. He had to get everybody together and travel for 3 days. Can you imagine what inside of him was doing like? On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. Now look at this statement. The boy and I will go over there to worship, then we'll come back to you. So Abraham appears from this to know something that the rest of them didn't know, the confidence and the faith that he had in God and who God was and what God could do. By the way, where was the place where Isaac was supposed to be sacrificed? It's where Jerusalem is today. It's Mount Moriah. That's what the belief is. It's where the temple was built, the Temple Mount. 22:6. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. Not only is he going to sacrifice Isaac, he made him carry the wood. That's bad. In his hand he took the fire and the sacrificial knife. And I put the definition for that knife because this is not just a regular knife. When you look at the Hebrew word for this was a knife that was especially made for killing, for eating, or killing for sacrifice. This wasn't just a knife for carving things out of sticks and so on. This was a special knife. So Isaac would have known what this knife was for. Abraham knew what this knife was for, and he said he laid the wood on Isaac and had him to carry it up there, and then he had the fire and carried the sacrificial knife. Now Genesis 22:7. Then Isaac, here's the good part. Now think about this discussion. Then Isaac spoke to his father Abraham and said, my father. He replied, here am I, my son. Isaac said, the fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? He's getting a little bit suspicious. He said, where's the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham's answer was, Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. Then the two of them walked on together. I put the way the King James Version puts that. I like the way it does that. It says, my son, God will provide himself a lamb. I just like that wording because that's what he did. Where we have an advantage over the Jews of the day and all the rabbis and all the different ones is we have the New Testament. So we can go to, when you go to Hebrews 11:7, it gives us some insight into Abraham's thinking that it doesn't give us in the book of Genesis, and you wouldn't know otherwise unless you've read from here in Hebrews 11:17. It says, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. So in other words, that's saying like he offered up Isaac. He made the sacrifice. Offered up Isaac. He received the promises, and he was offering his unique son. And he was offering his unique son. The one it had been said. Now this is what God had told Abraham about him. Your seed will be traced through Isaac. Now Abraham knew that God had told him that his seed was going to be traced through Isaac. And here he is killing Isaac. Now look what it says. He considered God to be able even to raise someone from the dead, And as an illustration, he received him back. Genesis 25:5, the last part of it says, then we'll come back to you. He told the two men that he carried with him, he said, we're going to go up there and sacrifice, and we will come back to you. He was planning on bringing Isaac back with him. Even if he had to kill him, and even if, according to Hebrews here, even if God had to raise him from the dead, that's what would happen. And figuratively, in this case, God did raise Isaac from the dead, because Abraham made the sacrifice. He got the wood, he got the altar ready, he tied up Isaac, and of course, if Isaac was 20 years old, like I think he was, Isaac had to help him. So by this time, he was beginning to kind of figure out what was going on. So he must have trusted Abraham pretty good. And so he was going through all this and set him up there and was ready to sacrifice. So in his heart, in his mind, he had sacrificed Isaac. It wasn't just figurative for him. It really was. It was real. And the rabbis, many of them say they don't call it, we call it the sacrifice of Isaac. When we talk about this, they call it the binding of Isaac, because they don't have the New Testament to help see the fulfillment of it. Genesis 22:9. When they arrived at the place that God had told him about, Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood. He bound his son Isaac and placed him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out and took the knife to slaughter his son. He was getting ready to do the deed. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Okay. It's put there about that uses a euphemistic sacrifice. Slaughter is the word. If you look at the Hebrew word, it's slaughter. His son is what is the act that he was doing. What's hard for us to conceive of in the area of the world where Abraham grew up and where he lived his whole life, and he lived in the land of Canaan at this particular time, human sacrifice was nothing unusual. Child sacrifice was nothing unusual. It was practiced all over that particular area. Human sacrifice was practiced over here in the Americas before Europeans ever came here. They had, in fact, you'll see some of these works that they have there, and the real steep stairs that go up and up and up and up. At the top, they'd take somebody up there and they would slaughter them and roll them down the steps or throw them off the back, depending on what type of ceremony it was. That's what people were practicing. That's back up even into the 14th and 15th century. People were still practicing human sacrifice. It was nothing unusual in his day. So Abraham wouldn't have thought about that being strange from that standpoint, because that's what all the other gods expected of their people, was to do human sacrifice, to slaughter babies, kill children, and so on. But human sacrifice was a very pronounced part of civilization at that particular time. Genesis 22:12. Then he said, do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your only son from me. Do you think, after this episode, what do you think happened to Abraham's faith and trust in God? It's been growing all the time, and what he's asked of Abraham has been growing all the time, has been getting harder and harder and harder, until it gets up to this point where he tells him to sacrifice his son. Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering in place of his son. And Abraham named that place, the Lord will provide. And I think that's the way we'd see it be, Jehovah Jireh. God will provide. The Lord will provide. So today it is said, it will be provided on the Lord's mountain. Then verse 15, then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, this is the Lord's declaration. Because you have done this thing and have not withheld your only son, I will indeed bless you and make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky and the sand on the seashore. Your offspring will possess the gates of their enemies. And not only that, and all nations of the earth will be blessed. Do you think Abraham knew what that meant? But all nations of the earth have been blessed because of this. By your offspring, because you have obeyed my command. Abraham went back to his young men, and they got up and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham settled in Beersheba. Now, I want to cover something here, and the reason to do it is because you might read it somewhere. Again, some of the Jewish rabbis, many of them, say that Abraham never went back to live with Sarah again after that, because she found out what he was going to do to Isaac, and she wouldn't have him back, is basically what they say. And they base this on the fact, they said they went together to Beersheba, and Abraham settled in Beersheba. This is the last verse in that chapter, and so I'm going to read just the first verse of the 23rd chapter. It says, Now Sarah lived 127 years. These were all the years of her life. Sarah died in Kiriath Arba, which is in Hebron. That's not Beersheba. So she was in a different place. What does that mean? We don't know, because it ends with this verse and starts with this verse. He and Sarah could have settled in Beersheba. They could have moved here. There's any number of things that could have happened. We have no idea. There's no way of telling that. And I got some pictures to help us see that. Here's Beersheba. You can see Israel. You can see the Dead Sea over here. You can see Beersheba here, and Jerusalem, where Mount Moriah would have been. What you can't see on there is where it says that she was, where she died, but you can on here, because it shows, I thought it named it. Anyway, here's Jerusalem. You go straight, that's Hebron. Hebron is the place that is, that they referred to there, but they didn't call it Hebron. This is where Hebron is today, and you can see this is where they call the occupied West Bank, or the West Bank, Palestinian territory, whatever you want to call it. This is where it is, and this is where Hebron is. So if you follow this is a map, so it doesn't, you don't have to travel this way. But this is, if you don't want to travel through here, you do. But this shows Jerusalem. So this is where the sacrifice of Isaac took place, was up here at Mount Moriah. And they had to travel back through here and to here in order to settle here. And this is where they settled. That's the reason. Another reason I don't agree with what the rabbis say is because they came through here most likely to get to here. So I don't doubt. I kind of doubt at this point that Sarah knew what was going on, because I doubt that Abraham told her before he left. Can you imagine? I'm going to take Isaac, you know your son Isaac, I'm going to take him up, I'm going to slit his throat, I'm going to offer him up on a... Do you think he'd have told... No, he wouldn't have told Sarah. If he's a smart man, he wouldn't have told her. Wouldn't have told her anything about it. But so when he came back through here, they wound up settling down here. But it doesn't fill all that material in between. And when it doesn't fill all that in between, what do we human beings do? We start stuffing stuff in there. We start making assumptions and jumping to conclusions when we don't know. It doesn't tell us. We don't have the foggiest idea. If you want to say that they separated, they never lived together again, and it says, one rabbi said, it never speaks of them, he and Sarah having a conversation again. It goes from the last verse of the 22nd chapter down here. It says settled in Beersheba. The very next verse is the 23rd verse, first chapter. There's not enough room in there for them to say anything, for them to have discussions between him and Sarah. So as far as I'm concerned, no, that doesn't hold water. He made the sacrifice. What he told Sarah, and he might have told, for all I know, he might have told Isaac, said, look, you don't tell your mama. This is between us. It's between you and me. We're not going to tell Mama about this one. If he was a smart man, that's what he'd have done. Because we don't know where Sarah's thinking was with this, because the covenant was made with Abraham. Presentation finished. Any questions?